Hey guys, tonight we are stepping back into one of the most dramatic, terrifying, and genuinely fascinating periods in all of human history. The Age of the Black Death, when plague stalked the streets of medieval Europe like an uninvited guest who absolutely refused to leave. You are going to walk through the gates of a city in the grip of full-blown pestilence, and I want you to feel every cobblestone, every gust of foul wind, every flicker of torchlight on a face that looks just a little too pale. This is not a comfortable story. It is a sleepy one, yes, slow and detailed and carried on a gentle current of narration, but it is the kind of story that makes you deeply, profoundly grateful for your mattress, your clean water, and the fact that you live in a century with functioning sanitation. You probably won't survive this, by the way. Statistically speaking, you have roughly a 1 in 3 chance of making it to the end of the year, and that is if you are lucky, careful, and have an extraordinary talent for not touching things. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop a comment letting me know where you are tuning in from tonight and what time it is where you are. I genuinely love seeing those roll in, whether you are in a rainy bedroom in Manchester at midnight or lying on a couch in Auckland at 3 in the morning wondering why you keep doing this to yourself. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The year is somewhere in the middle of the 14th century. Let's say 1348, because by that point the plague has already made itself thoroughly at home across much of Europe, and the city you are approaching, let's call it a composite, a kind of greatest hits collection of every plague-era European settlement, is deep in the thick of it. You have been traveling for several days. You are tired. Your feet ache in the way that only truly medieval feet can ache, which is to say completely, bone deeply, in a manner that no amount of modern foam insole technology could have prevented. You have been walking on dirt roads that alternate between ankle-deep mud and ankle-twisting ruts, and the last in you slept and smelled strongly of wet dog and something you decided not to investigate further. The city appears on the horizon just as the afternoon light begins to turn golden, and for a moment, just a brief, deceiving moment, it looks almost beautiful. The towers of a cathedral rise above the roofline, catching the last warm light. There is a river glinting somewhere beyond the walls. Smoke rises from a dozen chimneys in thin, lazy columns. You can hear, faintly, the sound of bells. You are tired and hungry, and you tell yourself that things are going to be better inside those walls. You tell yourself that, but there is a small, instinctive part of your brain, the ancient lizard brain part that kept your ancestors alive on the savannah, that is quietly, insistently suggesting you turn around and go back the way you came. You do not listen to it. That is your first mistake. As you get closer, the details begin to resolve themselves in ways that are considerably less charming than the distant silhouette suggested. The road leading to the main gate is not, as you might have hoped, busy with the normal traffic of a functioning medieval city. Merchants with carts, pilgrims in groups, farmers bringing produce to market. Instead, it is strangely sparse. There are a few figures moving along it, yes, but they move quickly and with their heads down, the way people move when they are trying not to make eye contact with the universe. Off to the side of the road, perhaps 200 meters from the city wall, there is a large open field that you initially mistake for a construction site. It is not a construction site. The trenches are long and wide and freshly dug, and there are people working in them, or rather, people are being placed in them because the workers are not building anything. They are burying. Even from this distance you can see the shapes being lowered, the unhurried efficiency of men who have done this so many times in recent weeks that it has stopped being shocking and become simply a job. A priest stands at the edge of one trench, and you can see his lips moving, though you cannot hear the words. He is performing rites quickly, the way a man performs rites when there are more rites to perform before dark. This is what historians refer to as a plague pit, and the city you are approaching has apparently needed several of them. You file this information away in the part of your brain that is now significantly louder in its recommendation that you turn around. You keep walking. The gate itself is a massive, heavy thing. Iron-banded oak, fitted into a stone archway that has stood for a couple of centuries and will stand for a couple more, indifferent to the chaos happening on both sides of it. There are guards posted here, which is reassuring until you get close enough to see that one of them is leaning against the wall with the particular limpness of a man who is either extremely tired or running a significant fever. The other guard, younger, with the kind of patchy beard that suggests he is doing his best. eyes you with a suspicion that is entirely justified given that you are a stranger arriving at a plague city and apparently doing so on purpose. He asks where you have come from. You tell him. He asks if anyone in your party has been sick. You tell him no, which is true, since you are alone, and also slightly optimistic given what the next few hours are likely to bring. He squints at you for a long moment, then at your hands, then at your neck, checking. You realize for the swollen lumps that are the most famous calling card of bubonic plague, the enlarged lymph nodes that medieval people called buboes, and that gave the disease one of its many names. He does not see any, which means either you are not yet infected or the infection has not progressed far enough to show, and the guard has absolutely no way of knowing which of those two things is true. This, in a nutshell, is the central public health problem of the medieval plague era. By the time you can see it, it is far too late. He lets you in. It is worth pausing here to understand exactly what you are walking into, because the scale of what the Black Death did to Europe is one of those historical facts that never quite loses its power to stagger the imagination, no matter how many times you encounter it. The plague, caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis, though nobody in 1348 knows that or would particularly care, had arrived in Europe via the trading routes from Central Asia, carried along the Silk Road and then across the Mediterranean by ship, and it moved through the continent with a speed and lethality that contemporaries struggled to find words for. Historians estimate that somewhere between a third and a half of Europe's entire population died within a few years of the plague's arrival. Think about that. 1 in every 2 or 3 people, every family touched, every village, every city, every monastery and castle and farm. The population of Europe would not recover to its pre-plague levels for over a century. There is a quirky footnote to this that historians sometimes point to. The city of Milan, famously, had one of the lowest death rates from the Black Death of any major Italian city. And one popular theory for why involves the city's lords simply sealing infected households completely shut, bricking up the doors and windows with the sick and well alike inside, leaving food through small openings, and essentially sacrificing some to save the many. Historians still argue whether this brutal quarantine policy was truly effective or whether Milan's relative survival was due to other factors entirely, including geography, luck, and population density. But it tells you something about the desperate calculus people were running in these cities, the cold triage of a world in which normal moral calculations had been temporarily suspended by necessity. None of this is cheerful, but you are inside the walls now, and it is too late for second thoughts. The first thing that strikes you, and we will get much deeper into this in a moment because it genuinely deserves its own extended meditation, is the smell. Even braced for a medieval city, even having spent days on muddy roads and nights in questionable inns, the smell of this place in this particular crisis moment is something else entirely. It hits you before you have taken 10 steps through the gate, a complex and layered assault on your senses that your modern nose is catastrophically ill-equipped to handle. But beyond the smell, what you notice most immediately is the quiet. Not silence, the city is not silent. You can hear coughing from the upper windows of the buildings lining the street. You can hear, somewhere deeper in the city, a cart with a squeaky wheel. You can hear dogs which have apparently survived in significant numbers and are now roaming in loose, well-fed packs, and you would rather not think too hard about why they are so well-fed. What is missing is the noise of a functioning, bustling, normal medieval city, the shouting of vendors, the arguments between neighbors, the constant clatter of workshops and commerce. All of that has been muffled by fear, by death, by the simple arithmetic of a population that has lost a staggering proportion of its members in a very short amount of time. The street you are walking down is cobbled, which is a luxury, actually, compared to many medieval cities, and suggests you have found yourself somewhere reasonably prosperous. The buildings rise on either side of you, 3 or 4 stories tall, their upper floors jutting out over the street in the characteristic overhang of medieval timber frame construction, which has the effect of making the street feel like a canyon. The sky above is a narrow stripe of fading afternoon blue. The windows of the upper floors are mostly shuttered. The ground floor shops, the ones that have not been permanently boarded up, are a mixed picture, some open with wary-faced proprietors standing in doorways, some closed and dark, some with small bunches of dried herbs hanging above the door, which is the medieval equivalent of putting out a sign that says, "I am aware of miasma theory, and I am doing my best." A woman hurries past you with her face buried in a cloth that has been soaked in some kind of aromatic vinegar. You can smell it cutting through the ambient unpleasantness like a knife through very bad cheese. She does not look at you. Nobody really looks at strangers right now. Making eye contact with a stranger is the first step toward caring about them. And caring about people is a resource-intensive activity in a world where everyone around you is dying. You pass a church. Its doors are open, and inside you can see candles burning in extraordinary numbers, and a priest conducting what appears to be a mass but to a congregation of perhaps 8 people in a space built for several hundred. There are flowers on the altar, wilting ones, suggesting they have been there for several days, and the priest's voice is a low, steady murmur that drifts out into the street and mingles with the smell and the quiet and the distant sound of the cart with the squeaky wheel. It is, in a strange way, beautiful. It is also terrifying. The beauty and the terror are, you are starting to realize, completely inseparable in this place. You need to find somewhere to sleep, something to eat, and some kind of plan for surviving what is clearly going to be a deeply challenging few days. The city is not welcoming, exactly, but it has let you in, and that is something. You are here. You are breathing, which is more than can be said for a significant portion of the people who were here 6 months ago. Tomorrow is going to be quite a day. The smell is its own kind of weather system. That is the only way to describe it. Really, it does not simply exist in the air the way smells normally do, as transient visitors that arrive and depart and leave you more or less as they found you. The smell has mass. It has texture. It settles on your skin and your clothes and the inside of your nose with the comfortable permanence of something that has absolutely no intention of leaving. You have been inside the walls for perhaps 20 minutes, and already you are beginning to understand, at a deep and visceral level, why medieval people believed that bad air could kill you. Not because they were right exactly, but because they were working from data, from the undeniable, overwhelming sensory fact of what a city full of sickness and death and pre-modern sanitation actually smells like, and they drew the most logical conclusion available to them. The theory they arrived at was called miasma theory, and it was, for most of the medieval period and well beyond, the dominant explanation for how disease spread. The word miasma comes from the Greek for pollution or defilement, and the theory held that illness was caused by bad air, specifically by the kind of thick, corrupt, rotting-smelling air that you would find in swamps, in graveyards, in crowded cities, in anywhere that organic matter was decaying in large quantities. The logic was elegant in its simplicity. Places that smelled bad were places where people got sick. Therefore, the smell itself, or rather whatever invisible corruption the smell signified, was the mechanism of illness. You breathed in the bad air got into your blood and your humors, and you became sick. This theory was wrong, of course, but it was wrong in a way that was almost right, which is the most frustrating kind of wrong. The plague was not spread by smell. It was spread primarily by the bites of infected fleas, which lived on rats, and secondarily through respiratory droplets in the pneumonic form of the disease. But the conditions that produced the smell, the crowding, the poor sanitation, the accumulation of waste, the dead bodies, the rats, were exactly the conditions that also spread the plague. So the medieval physician who told you to flee the bad air and seek clean country breezes was giving you advice that would, in practice, reduce your exposure to infected fleas and infectious people, even though his reasoning was entirely wrong. Historians still argue whether miasma theory, despite its fundamental incorrectness, may have accidentally saved as many lives through behavioral guidance as it failed to save through its misunderstanding of mechanism. You find this cold comfort as you stand on a cobblestone street trying to breathe through your sleeve. Let us be specific about the component elements of what you are smelling, because specificity is grounding, and also because your nose deserves an explanation for what it is currently enduring. The base layer, the note that a perfumer would call the foundation of this particular fragrance, is the smell of the street itself. Medieval city streets were not merely unpaved or poorly maintained. They were actively, deliberately used as waste disposal systems. Household waste of every conceivable variety went into the street. Kitchen scraps, broken crockery, worn-out cloth, wood ash from fires, and yes, human waste, because while many medieval cities had some form of latrine or cesspit system, the enforcement of proper waste disposal was approximately as rigorous as you might imagine given that the enforcement officers were also dying of plague. The animals add their own considerable contribution. Medieval cities were full of animals, not just the rats, which we will get to, but horses and oxen pulling carts, pigs that were often kept even in urban areas, chickens wandering more or less freely, the aforementioned well-fed dogs. All of these animals produce waste continuously and with great enthusiasm, and all of that waste ends up on the street. In a functioning, healthy city at a normal time, the accumulated filth of the street was managed. Imperfectly, chaotically, but managed, by a combination of rain, rooting pigs, poor people collecting dung for agricultural use, and the basic social pressure of not wanting to live in absolute squalor. In a plague city where a third of the workforce is dead or dying and social order is fraying at the edges, the management system has broken down, and what you are smelling is the result. Above this foundation layer, there is something sharper and more alarming. There is the smell of the sick. If you have ever been in a hospital ward or spent time with someone seriously ill, you will have a small, faint sense of what this is, the particular quality of fever sweat, of bodies fighting infection, of the metabolic byproducts of illness leaking through skin and breath. Now multiply that by an entire city's worth of sick people, remove the antiseptic and the clean linen and the ventilation systems, and add the medieval medical treatment of the day, which often involved applying poultices of various aromatic and not at all hygienic substances to the body. The smell coming from the upper floor windows of the houses you are passing, the ones that are not shuttered, the ones where someone inside is too sick or too fevered to close the shutters, is a smell that you are going to carry with you for a very long time. And then there is the top note, the sharpest and most unmistakable element of the whole composition, which is the smell of death itself. Medieval people were not unfamiliar with this smell under normal circumstances. In a world without modern medical care, people died at home regularly, and the process of washing and preparing a body for burial was a domestic task, handled by family members. But normal circumstances involved one death at a time, with the body prepared and removed and buried within a day or two in warm weather. What you are smelling now is not one death at a time. Bodies have been lying in houses for days in some cases, because the family members who would normally prepare them are either also dead or too sick to perform the task, and the gravediggers and death carts are operating at a capacity that has been exceeded for weeks. There are bodies that have not yet been collected. The city knows it and smells it and can do very little about it. The medieval response to all of this was, given the tools available, surprisingly systematic. Aromatic herbs were burned in enormous quantities, rosemary, juniper, thyme, bay laurel, both in churches and in private homes, on the theory that good-smelling air would counteract or drive away the bad-smelling air that carried the plague. Physicians carried pomanders, which were small perforated containers filled with aromatic substances, dried flowers, spices, camphor, worn around the neck or held to the nose when visiting patients. The famous plague doctor's mask, with its long bird-like beak, was designed to be filled with aromatic herbs and spices, essentially a wearable pomander for the professional who needed both hands free. You will not have seen many of these masks yet, because you have only been in the city for 20 minutes, but you will see one soon enough, and it will be one of the stranger visual experiences of your medieval adventure. Here is a genuinely odd quirk of medieval aromatic medicine that tends to delight people when they hear it. One of the recommended preventative treatments for plague, endorsed by actual university-trained physicians, was to keep a goat in your house. The reasoning was that goats produced strong-smelling emissions that would, in theory, help maintain a consistent aromatic environment that might neutralize miasmatic air. Whether any of the people who followed this advice found it helpful is not recorded, but one imagines that whatever benefits the goat provided in terms of miasmatic protection were partially offset by the goat's contribution to the overall olfactory situation. As you walk deeper into the city, picking your way around the worst of what the street has to offer, you begin to notice the other sensory layers of this place asserting themselves. The sound profile of a plague city is distinctive. There are the church bells, which ring almost constantly, not in the celebratory pealing of a normal functioning city, but in the slow, single-toll pattern of death bells, marking the passing of another soul. In a city where hundreds of people are dying per day, the bells become a kind of permanent ambient feature of the soundscape, a bass note under everything else. There are accounts from contemporary chroniclers who mentioned that the bells were eventually silenced in some cities, not as a sign of disrespect for the dead, but because the living had decided, collectively, that they could not keep hearing it. The light in the city has a particular quality, too. a dimness that is partly the narrow streets and overhanging buildings and partly the pall of wood smoke from all the aromatic burning, and partly something more intangible, a quality of diminishment that cities have when they are not operating at full capacity. You notice how many of the workshop shutters are closed: the blacksmith's forge, the tanner's yard, the fuller's shop where cloth was processed. These are the artisan trades that keep a medieval city functioning, and they require workers, and the workers are in short supply. The economic life of the city has contracted the way a living thing contracts when it is injured, pulling inward, preserving what it can. There is a man sitting on a doorstep ahead of you. He is middle-aged, with a goodwill cloak that suggests he was prosperous not so long ago, and he is simply sitting, staring at the middle distance with the specific blank expression of someone who has moved through grief and out the other side into a place that does not yet have a name. You slow as you approach because some part of you wants to ask if he is all right, which is a question that so thoroughly misunderstands his situation that you decide not to ask it. You give him a wide berth instead, which is both socially appropriate and epidemiologically prudent, and he does not look up as you pass. The rats, you begin to notice, are conspicuous by their relative absence, which is counterintuitive. You would expect a plague city to be overrun with rats, and in normal times the rat population of a medieval city was indeed staggering. But rats die of plague too. Yersinia pestis is, in some ways, as lethal to rats as it is to people, and a significant die-off in the rat population is, epidemiologically speaking, actually a warning sign rather than a reassurance. When the rats start dying in large numbers, the infected fleas they carry begin looking for new hosts, and those new hosts are you. The rats you do see are behaving oddly, moving slowly, visible in daylight in ways that rats normally are not, with the dull-eyed lethargy of illness. You do not yet know to interpret this as a warning, because you do not yet know how the plague actually spreads. Nobody does in 1348. What people do know, or rather what they have concluded from careful, terrified observation, is that the plague spreads through proximity. You get it from being near people who have it. You get it from touching them, from being in the same room, from handling their belongings. This conclusion, while it misses the flea and rat mechanism, is not entirely wrong in practical terms, since a sick person's coughing and breathing in enclosed spaces is one of the transmission routes for pneumonic plague, the respiratory form of the disease. The result is a social atmosphere that you can feel almost as physically as you can feel the smell. A constant low-level wariness, a reluctance to get too close, a quick stepping away when a stranger comes near. This wariness reshapes everything about social interaction in the city. The normal press and bustle of medieval street life, the bumping of shoulders, the casual touching, the communal use of shared spaces, has been replaced by a careful choreography of distance. People walk in the middle of the street rather than close to the buildings. When two people do speak to each other, they stand slightly farther apart than feels natural. The handshake, that ancient gesture of greeting and trust, has been largely suspended. You notice all of this because you are attuned to social cues, and because the absence of normal social touching in a pre-modern urban environment is deeply strange, like watching a film where the sound has been slightly turned down. The physicians of the day were doing their best with the tools available to them, and their understanding of the atmosphere and its role in disease was genuinely sophisticated within its own framework. The concept of corrupt air was not simply a superstition. It was a theoretical framework built on centuries of observation and classical learning, drawing on Hippocrates and Galen and the entire tradition of humoral medicine. A medieval physician observing the plague would note that it spread in crowded areas, that it seemed to follow trade routes, that it was worse in warm, wet weather, that it was concentrated in low-lying areas near rivers. None of these observations were wrong. The theory that explained them, the miasma theory, was wrong, but the observations themselves were real and careful and the product of genuine medical intelligence doing its best under impossible conditions. You take a corner and walk into a small square where a fountain stands at the center. A few people are gathered here, filling clay jugs and leather flasks. The water looks, well, let us say it looks like medieval water, which is to say it has a faint turbidity that your 21st century sensibility finds alarming but which is entirely unremarkable here. You are thirsty. You have been walking all day. The water is right there. We will talk more about the water situation shortly, because it deserves a full and considered discussion, but for now you make a mental note to address the hydration question with great care. A cart comes around the corner into the square. It is drawn by a single exhausted-looking horse, and the cart bed is covered with a piece of rough canvas. Everyone in the square steps back from it automatically, giving it a wide berth with the practiced, reflexive caution of people who know exactly what that cart contains and where it is going. The driver, a large, weathered man with a cloth tied around his nose and mouth, does not make eye contact with anyone. He drives through the square and out the other side without stopping, the horse's hooves loud on the cobblestones, and then he has gone around another corner and the square is quiet again and the people at the fountain go back to filling their jugs as if nothing has happened. Because this is simply what Tuesday looks like now. You stand in the square for a moment, breathing, carefully, shallowly, through your nose because you have heard somewhere that the nose filters air better than the mouth, which is advice that will do approximately nothing in terms of plague prevention, but which at least gives you something to concentrate on besides the cart and where it is going. The afternoon is fading into early evening. The light is going golden and then orange. The cathedral bells have begun their slow, regular tolling. You need shelter. You need it soon. Finding a room in a plague city turns out to be one of those tasks that sounds simple until you actually attempt it, at which point it reveals itself to be a layered exercise in negotiation, desperation, and the management of expectations that have been significantly lowered by circumstance. In a normal medieval city at a normal time, the process of securing lodging for a traveler would involve locating one of the city's inns or taverns, establishments that combined the functions of pub, restaurant, and hotel in the way that medieval hospitality tended to do, paying a modest fee, and being shown to a space that might be a private room if you were wealthy, a shared room if you were middling, or a spot on the floor of the common room if you were neither. The floor option was more common than the private room option, and the shared room was the default experience for most travelers, which meant sleeping in close proximity to strangers of varying degrees of hygiene and sobriety. Under normal circumstances, this was merely unpleasant. Under current circumstances, the calculation is considerably more complicated. You find the first inn by following a painted sign, a crude but recognizable depiction of a bush, which is the traditional symbol of a wine-selling establishment going back to Roman times, the medieval equivalent of a neon open sign, down a side street that runs parallel to the main road. The building is a substantial one, 3 stories of timber and plaster with a ground floor common room whose door stands partially open. You push it wider and step inside, and the first thing you notice is that it is much emptier than an inn at this hour ought to be. There are perhaps 4 people in a room built for 30, each sitting alone at widely separated tables, each with the hunched, self-contained posture of people who are here because they have nowhere better to be but are keenly aware of the risks of being here at all. The innkeeper, a broad woman of about 50 with an expression that suggests she has seen everything twice and found it all equally tiresome, looks at you from behind the counter with the particular assessment gaze of someone deciding in real time whether your money is worth the trouble of your presence. She asks where you have come from. You tell her. She asks how long you have been on the road. You tell her. She asks, with the directness of someone who has stopped caring about social niceties somewhere around the 4th week of the plague, whether you feel well. You tell her yes, which is true, though the word feels increasingly provisional the longer you spend in this city. She looks at your neck. She looks at your hands. She names a price for a room that is roughly 3 times what you would expect to pay in normal times, which is either opportunistic price gouging or a rational risk premium depending on your perspective, and probably both. You pay it. Of course you pay it. Where else are you going to go? The room she shows you to is on the 2nd floor, accessed by a staircase so steep and narrow that ascending it requires a negotiation between your body and gravity that feels genuinely adversarial. The room itself is small, perhaps 4 meters by 3, with a straw mattress on a wooden frame, a single shuttered window, a tallow candle in a clay holder, and a ceramic chamber pot that has been recently emptied, which counts as a luxury. The walls are plastered and whitewashed, which was the standard interior finish for a decent medieval room, and someone has hung a small wooden cross above the bed and a bundle of dried rosemary above the window. The combined spiritual and aromatic defense strategy of a room that has hosted a lot of anxious travelers lately. The mattress deserves a moment of consideration, because it is going to be your home for the foreseeable future and it has a complex biography. Straw mattresses in medieval inns were notoriously difficult to keep clean, because straw is both an excellent bedding material and an excellent habitat for a wide variety of small creatures that would very much like to share it with you. Fleas, lice, bedbugs, all of them found the combination of warm straw and regular human occupancy to be a highly desirable living arrangement. In a normal inn at a normal time, the presence of fleas in your mattress was an accepted annoyance, the medieval equivalent of a hotel room that gets a little street noise. In a plague city in 1348, the presence of fleas in your mattress is a matter of rather more serious concern, since fleas are the primary vector of Yersinia pestis and the mattress before you has been slept in by an unknown number of people over the past several weeks, some of whom may have been considerably less healthy than they appeared when they checked in. You sit on the edge of the mattress very carefully and think about this for a moment. The rat situation in the building becomes apparent shortly after you settle in. You can hear them in the walls, a constant, low-level scratching and scrabbling that medieval residents of timber-frame buildings were so accustomed to that they genuinely stopped noticing it, the way you stop noticing the sound of traffic if you live near a busy road. Rats had been a fact of urban life for so long in medieval Europe that they had essentially ceased to register as remarkable. They were managed, imperfectly, by cats, and the plague years created an interesting dynamic around cats, because the widespread medieval belief that cats were associated with witchcraft and the devil had led to periodic cat persecutions in various parts of Europe in the preceding centuries, which had reduced urban cat populations in some areas just when a robust cat population would have been most useful. Historians still argue whether the persecution of cats in medieval Europe was widespread enough and sustained enough to have meaningfully affected rat populations and thereby plague spread, or whether this is a pleasing narrative that somewhat overstates the actual historical record. What is not in dispute is that the rats in this building are numerous, and that they are interacting freely with the straw in your mattress, and that they are carrying fleas, and that some of those fleas are carrying Yersinia pestis. This is not information you have access to in 1348, but your skin, with an instinctive wisdom of its own, begins to itch almost immediately upon contact with the mattress, which may be psychosomatic or may be entirely justified. The housing situation in the broader city is a study in rapid social reorganization under pressure. Medieval cities were already densely packed by the standards of any era. The walls that provided defense also constrained expansion, so buildings went up rather than out, and multiple families shared structures that modern eyes would consider barely adequate for one. When the plague began killing people in large numbers, this density became both a liability and, paradoxically, an opportunity. The liability is obvious. More people per square meter meant more exposure, more flea bites, more respiratory transmission of the pneumonic form of the disease. The opportunity was grimmer. As people died, the housing stock of the city effectively increased relative to the surviving population, meaning that those who survived could, in theory, move into better, larger, less crowded accommodations. In practice, people were extremely reluctant to move into a dead person's house. The belief that plague was spread by contact with infected persons and their belongings meant that a house where plague had struck was considered as dangerous as the plague itself. Some cities developed formal systems for marking such houses. A painted cross on the door, usually red, which you have been seeing throughout the city and which you now realize, with a slight chill, marks a completely different kind of establishment than the one whose sign you followed to find your inn. The Red Cross was the medieval equivalent of a biohazard symbol, communicating in a single visual shorthand the information that someone inside has plague, that you should not enter, and that whoever is inside is not coming out anytime soon. In some cities, the marking of houses went further. Families with plague were sometimes locked inside their own homes, prevented from leaving by external locks or by guards posted outside. A quarantine measure that was brutally effective in concept and horrifying in practice, since it meant that healthy members of a household were confined with sick ones, dramatically increasing their own exposure. The word quarantine itself comes from the Italian quarantina, meaning 40 days, the period that ships arriving in Venice and other Italian ports were required to anchor offshore before their passengers and crew could disembark. A measure that Venice instituted in 1377 and that represents one of the earliest formal public health interventions in European history. The number 40 had both practical and theological resonance, echoing the 40 days of Lent and of Christ's time in the desert, which gave the practice a moral weight that purely pragmatic reasoning might not have provided. Your room at the inn is not, as far as you know, a quarantine room, but the thinness of the walls means you can hear, from the room next door, a sound that you find yourself cataloging with great attention. The deep, wet cough of someone whose lungs are doing their best under difficult conditions. You sit on the edge of your flea-infested mattress and listen to the cough and think about miasma theory and wish, not for the last time today, that you had made different choices. The neighborhood around the inn has its own character, its own social ecology shaped by the plague. Medieval cities were organized into parishes, administrative and spiritual units based around a neighborhood church, and the parish was, in normal times, the fundamental unit of urban social life. Your neighbors were your parishioners. The priest who baptized your children and buried your dead was your parish priest. The church at the center of the parish was the building you went to weekly, the place where community gathered and maintained its coherence. In plague time, the parish structure was under enormous stress. Parish priests were dying at high rates. Their work required them to be present with the sick and dying, administering last rites and spiritual comfort in the most exposure-heavy settings imaginable, and replacements were hard to find, partly because the supply of trained clergy had been substantially depleted and partly because the job was, in the current climate, not attracting enthusiastic applicants. The consequence was that some neighborhoods had effectively lost their parish infrastructure, the spiritual and social glue that held the community together dissolving along with the priest and the church wardens and the guild members who organized charity and mutual aid. What replaced it, in some cases, was nothing particularly organized. Informal networks of surviving neighbors, impromptu arrangements for sharing food and looking out for the elderly and the orphaned, the basic human tendency toward cooperative behavior asserting itself in the absence of formal structure. In other cases, what replaced the parish infrastructure was something darker: the breakdown of the social compact, the emergence of opportunistic behavior, the exploitation of the vulnerable by those who were still mobile and still motivated by something other than simple survival. You are going to need to eat. The question of food in a plague city is its own complicated adventure, and you have not yet found anything to eat since that uncertain meal on the road this morning, which involved some bread that had achieved an advanced state of staleness and a piece of hard cheese that you ate quickly and without looking at too closely. The inn's common room, you noticed when you came through it, had a fire going in the hearth and a pot of something suspended over it, and the innkeeper had mentioned, in the tones of someone conferring a significant favor, that she was serving a pottage this evening to those residents who wanted it. Pottage is the medieval default food, the blank canvas onto which the entire social spectrum of the medieval diet was painted. At its simplest, it was a thick soup or porridge of whatever grains and vegetables were available: peas, beans, onions, leeks, turnips, barley, cooked long and slow in water with whatever scraps of meat or fat could be added for richness. It was nourishing, it was caloric, it was warm, and in the current situation it represented a meaningful calculation on your part about the relative risks of eating food prepared by a stranger in a plague city versus the certain misery of continued hunger. You decide to eat the pottage. As you make this decision, you become aware of something scrabbling under the floorboards directly beneath your feet. The rats again, conducting their own parallel lives in the structural skeleton of the building, indifferent to the human drama unfolding above them. They are, in their way, the real rulers of this city right now. They have been here longer than the current residents, and they will be here after the plague burns itself out, and they carry within them, in the bodies of their fleas, the mechanism of everything that is happening. They do not know this. They are just rats. They are looking for food and warmth and other rats, and they are finding all three in abundance in the walls and floors of this timber frame building on a narrow street in a plague city in the middle of the 14th century. You pick up the tallow candle and make your way back down the adversarial staircase to the common room. The fire is warm. The pottage smells, against all reasonable expectation given the day you have had, rather good. The four people at their separate tables do not look up when you come in. You sit down. You eat. You try not to think about what is in the mattress waiting for you upstairs, and about the sound of coughing through the wall, and about the scratch of small feet in the walls, and about all the things you do not yet know that are already quietly beginning to arrange themselves around you. The pottage is better than it has any right to be. This is the first genuinely pleasant surprise of your time in the plague city, and you are going to hold on to it with both hands, because pleasant surprises are in short supply, and you have learned in the past few hours to appreciate them with the intensity of someone who understands that they are finite. The innkeeper has put onions in it, and something that might be a small amount of salted pork, and there are soft, swollen barley grains that have been cooking long enough to have achieved a deeply satisfying mushiness. And you eat it with a wooden spoon and a thick slice of bread that you use to chase the last of it around the bowl, and for approximately 10 minutes, sitting by the fire in the nearly empty common room with the candles making warm circles of light on the plaster walls, you feel something approaching okay. Then you think about the water you used to wash your hands before eating, water from a jug that the innkeeper filled from the fountain in the square, and the feeling of okay recedes slightly. Water in a medieval city is a subject that rewards careful, anxious attention, especially in a plague city where the normal systems of waste management have broken down even further than usual. The medieval city's relationship with its water supply was intimate and complicated and frequently disastrous. A daily negotiation between the human need for clean water and the medieval city's remarkable talent for making water the opposite of clean. Cities drew their water from rivers, from wells, and from pipe systems where these existed. Some medieval cities had quite sophisticated piped water systems, drawing on Roman engineering traditions that had never entirely been forgotten. But the same rivers and the same groundwater that supplied the drinking water also received the waste of the city, in quantities and varieties that do not bear extended contemplation. Wells were particularly vulnerable. A medieval city well was typically a communal resource, shared by the households of a neighborhood, and its water quality depended entirely on what was happening in the soil between the well and the nearest cesspit, which was frequently not very much soil and not very much distance. In normal times, the water from a city well might give you a mild stomach upset or a bout of diarrhea that you would attribute to bad humors or the wrong alignment of celestial bodies, because the connection between contaminated water and gastrointestinal illness was not yet understood. In plague times, when the normal waste management systems had broken down and bodies were sometimes being disposed of with considerably less care than usual, the groundwater situation in a densely populated medieval city was, to use the technical term, quite bad. The bread you are eating is safer than the water, probably. Grain that has been milled and baked has passed through enough heat to kill most of the things that might otherwise make you ill, and bread was the foundational caloric source of the medieval diet. Not a side dish or an accompaniment, but the main event, the substance around which everything else was organized. A medieval person's daily bread consumption would strike a modern person as extraordinary. Estimates suggest that a working adult in a medieval city might consume between 1 and 2 pounds of bread per day, often supplemented by pottage or other grain-based preparations, with meat and fish appearing much less frequently and being distributed very unequally across the social spectrum. The grain situation in a plague city has its own complications. The agricultural system that fed medieval cities depended on a large rural workforce, peasants and serfs and tenant farmers working fields outside the city walls, and the plague was killing rural workers at the same rate it was killing urban ones. The harvest of 1348 and 1349 in many parts of Europe was catastrophically bad. Not because the weather was poor, but because there were not enough surviving agricultural workers to bring the crops in. Fields stood unharvested. Animals wandered unherded. The intricate system of labor that connected the rural hinterland to the urban food supply had been disrupted at every link simultaneously, and the result was food scarcity layered on top of epidemic disease, a combination that tends not to end well for anyone involved. Here is a quirky historical footnote that tends to amuse people despite the grim context. One of the paradoxical economic effects of the Black Death was a significant improvement in the material conditions of the peasants and agricultural laborers who survived it. The dramatic reduction in the labor supply meant that surviving workers could, for the first time in generations, demand higher wages and better conditions for their work. Landlords who had previously kept peasants in conditions of near-serfdom found themselves in the uncomfortable position of needing those peasants far more than the peasants needed any particular landlord. The resulting labor market shift contributed to the gradual erosion of feudal labor obligations and the slow emergence of something more like a wage economy in parts of Europe. Historians still argue about the extent to which the Black Death should be credited as a driver of long-term economic and social transformation versus how much it simply accelerated trends that were already underway before the plague arrived. You are not, in your current situation, in a position to benefit from these long-term structural changes. You are in a position of needing to eat today and tomorrow and hopefully for many days after that, which means you need to understand the food landscape of the plague city as it currently exists. The market, you discover the following morning when you venture out early, is operating on a reduced schedule and with a reduced selection. Medieval city markets were normally vivid, noisy, densely packed affairs, the commercial heart of urban life, where the agricultural surplus of the surrounding countryside met the purchasing power of the urban population, and where the social mixing of classes and occupations that characterized medieval city life was most visible. The market you find is a ghost of this. Perhaps a third of the normal number of stalls are set up, and the stalls that are there have less on them than usual. There is bread, there is always bread, because bakers were considered essential workers even in plague time, and the guild structures that organized the baking trade were robust enough to keep functioning even under severe stress. There are root vegetables looking slightly past their best. There is dried fish, which has the advantage of being shelf-stable and the disadvantage of smelling exactly the way you would expect dried fish to smell in a city that already has significant olfactory challenges. There is meat of uncertain provenance. The meat stall is operated by a butcher who has the kind of weathered competence that suggests he has been doing this work for 30 years and will continue doing it until something stops him, and the meat he is selling is fresh enough in the technical sense that it was recently an animal, though you find yourself deeply incurious about which animal or what its circumstances were before it became this particular cut of something reddish and glistening on a wooden board. You buy some. You cannot afford to be precious about protein sources right now. There is also, at the edge of the market, a stall selling something that you are going to encounter quite a lot in medieval food culture, which is preserved and fermented products of various kinds. Medieval people were extraordinarily skilled at food preservation, out of absolute necessity. In a world without refrigeration, keeping food edible across seasons required a sophisticated toolkit of techniques. Salting, smoking, drying, pickling in vinegar, fermenting, storing in fat. All of these methods were practiced with the pragmatic expertise of people for whom running out of food in February was not a dietary inconvenience but an existential crisis. The vinegar products, in particular, have an interesting relationship with the plague era. Vinegar, acidic, pungent, strongly aromatic, was one of the recommended prophylactic agents against plague according to the medical literature of the day. You were advised to drink it diluted in water, to wash your hands in it, to soak cloths in it and hold them to your face when moving through infected areas. The vinegar-soaked cloth you saw the woman carrying yesterday was not merely a comfort object but a prescribed medical intervention. Whether vinegar actually provided any protection is debatable. At the concentrations typically used, it would not have reliably killed Yersinia pestis, but the acidic washing of hands might have disrupted some surface bacteria, and the habit of keeping a cloth to your face in public might have reduced respiratory exposure to some degree. The medical establishment of the day had rather a lot of recommendations for how to avoid plague, and they were dispensed with the confident authority of people who genuinely did not know what they were talking about but were at least trying. The physician's dietary advice tended to favor light, easily digestible foods, poultry, fresh fish, young vegetables, and to discourage heavy, putrefying foods like aged cheeses, old meat, and anything that had begun to smell strongly, on the theory that consuming already rotting food would predispose your internal humors to the putrefaction that plague represented. This advice was actually fairly sensible from a general health perspective, even if the theoretical basis for it was wrong. Less sensible was the advice around emotional regulation, which held that strong emotions, particularly fear, grief, and anger, disturbed the humoral balance in ways that made you more susceptible to plague. This created a cruel paradox for plague-era people. The appropriate emotional response to watching your family die around you was the precise emotional state most likely, according to medical theory, to kill you next. You were advised to maintain a calm, cheerful disposition, to avoid dwelling on the deaths around you, to seek pleasant company and mild entertainment, to not think too hard about the fact that a third of Europe was dying. Medieval people were, on this evidence, expected to maintain a level of emotional regulation that most modern humans would find impressive even in considerably less challenging circumstances. Food and drink also intersected with the social disruptions of plague time in ways that reshaped the daily rhythms of the city. The shared meal, the communal table at a tavern, the guild feast, the parish dinner, was one of the fundamental social rituals of medieval urban life, and it had become fraught with the same anxieties that attended all close human contact. Eating together meant sitting together, breathing the same air, sharing vessels and bread in the way that communal medieval dining typically involved. Some people had stopped eating communally entirely, retreating to solitary meals in their rooms. Others, with the fatalistic logic of people who have decided that if the plague wants them it will find them regardless, continue to eat and drink in company with something close to defiance. The tavern culture of the plague city was a strange thing. Simultaneously a place of genuine human comfort, where surviving neighbors gathered around shared warmth and shared cups to remind themselves that they were still alive and that life still contained something worth experiencing. And a place of elevated epidemiological risk, where the close contact and shared surfaces of communal drinking provided excellent conditions for disease transmission. The people who kept going to taverns in plague time were not fools. They were people doing a rational, if implicit, calculation about the quality of life they were willing to trade for the quantity of it, and some of them had simply decided that a life spent alone in a shuttered room, eating solitary meals and avoiding all human contact, was not enough of a life to be worth the considerable effort of preserving it. You understand this, sitting in the common room of your inn with your bowl of pottage and your slightly questionable water, listening to the slow toll of the death bells in the distance. The fire is warm and the candlelight is soft and the innkeeper is moving quietly behind her counter doing something with a cloth that involves a great deal of focused attention. And there is one other person in the room, a young man of about 20 who arrived after you and is eating his pottage with the concentrated, appreciative attention of someone who has not eaten today and is making the most of the fact that he currently is. You give him a careful nod. He gives you one back. It is, by the standards of social interaction available in this city right now, an almost effusive display of human connection. The food at the market raises the question of what you can actually afford, which raises the broader question of the medieval economy during plague time. Money was circulating in strange ways. On one hand, the deaths of so many property owners and merchants had created unusual concentrations of wealth in unexpected places. Heirs who had never expected to inherit found themselves suddenly possessed of houses and businesses and money that had belonged to relatives now dead. And the spending behavior of these windfall beneficiaries was sometimes erratic in ways that disrupted normal market patterns. On the other hand, the collapse of so much economic activity, the closed workshops, the halted trade, the disrupted supply chains, meant that there was less to spend money on even as some people suddenly had more of it. The prices of essential goods had risen sharply, as you experienced at the inn. Bread was more expensive than it should be, partly because grain was scarcer and partly because the bakers who remained were in a strong enough position to charge more for their essential service. The cost of labor for any work that required physical proximity to other people, medical care, funeral services, the collection of the dead, had risen dramatically, for reasons that should be entirely obvious. The gravediggers, when you see them working, have the air of men who know they are indispensable and are charging accordingly. By midday, you have eaten enough to stabilize yourself, spent more money than you would like on food of uncertain quality, drunk water that you have decided to think of as probably fine, and navigated the market with the careful spatial awareness of someone who has internalized the need to maintain distance from strangers. Your hands smell of vinegar because you found a woman selling the stuff and bought a small flask of it on the entirely pragmatic grounds that everyone around you seems to consider it essential, and if it does nothing else it at least makes your hands smell clean, which is a form of psychological comfort worth purchasing. Now you need to think about your health more systematically, because you have been in this city for less than a day and already you can feel, or imagine you can feel, which at this point amounts to the same thing. A slight heaviness behind your eyes that may be fatigue from travel or maybe the first whisper of something you do not want to name. Either way, you should probably find a physician. This turns out to be a decision with consequences that you could not have anticipated from the outside but which, once you are inside the world of medieval plague medicine, make a terrible, fascinating kind of sense. The physician's house is not difficult to find, because it has a small crowd outside it. Not the cheerful, purposeful crowd of a busy professional's waiting room, but the particular kind of crowd that forms when people are simultaneously desperate for help and terrified of being too close to others who might also need help. Perhaps 8 or 10 people are gathered in loose, well-spaced clusters outside a substantial timber frame building on one of the better streets of the city, each maintaining the careful distance that has become the default social geometry of plague time. Some of them look obviously unwell. Flushed faces, the particular stillness of people conserving energy because they do not have much left. Others look like you, anxious, outwardly healthy, here for reasons that are more precautionary than acute. Nobody is talking much. The wait outside a plague physician's house is not an occasion for small talk. You join the loose end of the queue, if a scattered arrangement of frightened people at various distances from a closed door can be called a queue, and you wait. The door opens occasionally and a figure emerges from inside, sometimes accompanied by a servant who escorts them out with the brisk efficiency of someone managing a throughput problem, and then the door closes again and the waiting resumes. While you wait, you have time to study the building and its neighborhood, and to think about what you actually know about medieval medicine and what you are walking into. Medieval medicine in the 14th century was not the complete howling void that popular imagination sometimes suggests, but it was also not reassuring in any way that a modern patient would recognize. The medical tradition of medieval Europe drew on a confluence of sources: the classical Greek medicine of Hippocrates and Galen, filtered through centuries of Arab scholarship that had preserved, translated, and significantly extended the classical corpus, and then retranslated into Latin and taught in the emerging universities of Europe. By 1348, there were university medical faculties at Bologna, Paris, Montpellier, and several other European cities, producing graduate physicians who had spent years studying texts, debating theory, and learning the elaborate system of humoral medicine that organized all of medieval medical thinking. Humoral medicine held that the human body was governed by 4 fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, whose balance determined health and whose imbalance produced disease. Each humor was associated with qualities of heat, cold, moisture, and dryness, and with temperamental characteristics, and with organs of the body, and with the 4 seasons, and with the 4 elements, and with the positions of the planets. It was a comprehensive, internally consistent, intellectually sophisticated system that had exactly one significant problem, which was that it bore essentially no relationship to how the human body actually worked. Centuries of careful observation and detailed theorizing had been organized around a foundational misunderstanding, and the resulting medical practice, while not entirely without benefit, some herbal treatments worked for reasons that had nothing to do with the humoral theory explaining them, was systematically unable to understand, treat, or prevent the plague. The physician who eventually sees you is a man of about 60, wearing a long dark robe and a serious expression that does not waver when you describe your symptoms: the slight heaviness behind your eyes, the mild fatigue, the generalized anxiety that you are trying hard to distinguish from actual physical illness. He has you sit on a stool and examines you with practiced thoroughness. He takes your pulse at the wrist, not to measure its rate in the modern sense, but to assess its quality. Medieval pulse diagnosis involved evaluating the pulse's strength, speed, rhythm, and texture in ways that required years of practice to interpret within the humoral framework. He looks at your tongue. He examines your eyes. He asks about your diet, your sleep, your recent travel, your emotional state. He asks, with the matter-of-fact directness of someone for whom this question has become entirely routine, whether you have noticed any swellings under your arms, in your groin, or on your neck. You have not. He examines these areas himself with careful but not particularly gentle hands, and confirms the absence of buboes, which is the first genuinely good news of your time in this city. He sits back and regards you with the evaluative calm of a man who has seen several hundred patients in the past few weeks and has developed a rapid and fairly accurate triage for who needs what. His diagnosis, delivered in the measured tones of professional authority, is that your humoral balance has been disturbed by travel, by fear, and by exposure to corrupt air, and that your constitution is currently in a state of elevated vulnerability that requires careful management. He recommends a regimen that involves dietary modification, lighter foods, avoidance of anything putrefying or strongly aromatic in a bad way, increased consumption of vinegar-based preparations, along with a daily inspection of your lymph nodes, moderate exercise to promote healthy circulation of the humors, and the avoidance of strong emotion. He also recommends bloodletting. Bloodletting was, for the medieval physician, approximately what antibiotics are for a modern one, the go-to intervention for a very wide range of conditions, recommended with a confidence that reflected not evidence of effectiveness but the depth of its theoretical integration into the humoral system. If you had too much blood, or if your blood was corrupt or overheated, removing some of it would restore balance. Since plague was understood as a kind of corruption of the blood and humors, bleeding the patient was a logical response within the framework. The problem was that patients who were already weakened by illness could be significantly further weakened by bloodletting, and that the instruments used for the procedure, lancets and fleams that were used on multiple patients and cleaned with varying degrees of thoroughness, were an effective mechanism for spreading blood-borne diseases, though not, as it happened, the plague. You decline the bloodletting with a politeness that the physician accepts with mild disappointment, the way a modern doctor might accept your declining a recommended vaccine, noting your choice, expressing mild professional disagreement, and moving on. He gives you instead a small packet of dried herbs, a mixture of theriac, which was the great medieval cure-all, a compound preparation of dozens of ingredients including various aromatic herbs, honey, and in the original recipe viper flesh, though this version probably does not contain actual snake, and instructs you to dissolve some in warm wine each morning. The fee he charges is substantial. You pay it because you are already committed to this particular adventure in medieval healthcare, and there is no point in starting arguments with the one physician in the city who appears to still be operating. Now, the physician you have just seen represents the top of the medieval medical hierarchy, the university-trained, text-based, theoretically sophisticated end of a spectrum that descends fairly rapidly from there. Below the university physician in the social and professional hierarchy came the surgeon, and below the surgeon came the barber surgeon, and below the barber surgeon came an assortment of practitioners, herbalists, wise women, apothecaries, and outright quacks whose qualifications ranged from genuine empirical knowledge of herbal medicine to absolutely nothing at all except confidence and a good patter. The distinction between physician and surgeon in medieval medicine was not merely organizational but deeply philosophical. Physicians dealt with internal medicine, the regulation of the humors, the treatment of systemic disease, the adjustment of diet and lifestyle, and they did so primarily through the learned application of text-based theory. Surgeons dealt with the body's external structures: wounds, fractures, skin conditions, abscesses. The physician worked with his mind and his prescriptions. The surgeon worked with his hands. In the social hierarchy of medieval medicine, this manual work made the surgeon considerably less prestigious than the physician, despite the fact that a skilled surgeon with genuine anatomical knowledge and a steady hand was often more immediately useful to a patient than all the humoral theorizing in the world. The barber surgeon occupied a fascinating middle position in this hierarchy. A practitioner who combined the everyday services of barbering, haircuts, shaving, trimming of beards, with surgical procedures that required similar instruments and similar manual dexterity. Barber surgeons would pull teeth, lance abscesses, set simple fractures, and perform the bloodletting that the physician had recommended to you and that you had wisely declined. The red and white striped pole that still appears outside barber shops today is a direct descendant of the barber surgeon sign. The red representing blood, the white representing the bandages, and the pole itself representing the stick that patients gripped during bloodletting to encourage blood flow. This is one of those historical facts that seems too perfectly connected to be true but is entirely accurate. A small thread of direct continuity between the plague-era barber surgeon shop and the striped pole outside your local hairdresser. You pass one of these establishments on your way back from the physician. The barber surgeon is a compact, energetic man of about 40 who is simultaneously managing 3 customers. One in the chair getting a shave, one waiting on a bench, and one standing to the side with a bandaged arm that he is unwrapping for inspection. The shop smells of blood and vinegar and the astringent herbs used as wound dressings, and on a shelf above the workbench there is an array of instruments: lancets, probes, curved needles for stitching wounds, dental forceps, laid out with the organized competence of someone who takes professional pride in his tools. He looks up at you as you pause in the doorway, assesses you with the quick professional eye of a man who can tell at a glance whether you are a potential customer, and gives you a nod that manages to combine welcome with a clear message that he is quite busy. Historians still argue about whether the barber surgeons of medieval Europe, despite their theoretical limitations, may have had better practical outcomes in some areas than the university physicians, precisely because their knowledge was empirical rather than theoretical, built from direct observation of wounds and bodies rather than from the interpretation of ancient texts. A barber surgeon who had treated hundreds of infected wounds had accumulated practical knowledge about which herbal preparations seemed to reduce infection and which did not. Knowledge that was not systematically organized or theoretically explained, but that represented genuine learning from experience. Whether this empirical edge translated into better patient outcomes in plague specifically is impossible to know, but it is an interesting question. Below the barber surgeon, and considerably more visible in the streets of the plague city, are the people who occupy the lower end of the medical ecosystem. There is a woman at a market stall selling remedies. Small packets and vials and ceramic pots containing preparations whose ingredients she describes with the fluent confidence of someone who has been selling these things for years and knows exactly what her customers need to hear. She has plague preventatives, amulets containing dried toads, which were believed to draw the poison of the plague out of the body by sympathy, since toads were associated with earth and venom and countermagic. She has theriac in a preparation that she claims is particularly effective, though its relationship to the preparation you received from the physician is unclear. She has a preparation made from powdered emeralds, which was recommended in some medical texts as a cure for plague on the grounds that the green color of the stone corresponded symbolically to the bile corrupted by plague, a piece of reasoning that makes a kind of dream logic sense if you squint at it from exactly the right angle. The powdered emerald remedy was, it should be said, essentially harmless, emerald powder being an inert substance with no pharmacological activity, which puts it ahead of some of the plague treatments being practiced, including the application of live chickens to the buboes. This was a genuine recommended treatment, endorsed by practitioners in several parts of Europe, based on the theory that the chicken's vital heat and its affinity for drawing out toxins through its body would help extract the plague poison from the swelling. The chicken, unsurprisingly, tended not to thrive under this treatment, and there is no evidence it benefited the patient either, but it was administered with sincere therapeutic intent by people doing their absolute best. Here is perhaps the most illuminating quirky detail of medieval plague medicine. One of the most consistent recommendations across medical texts of the era, from the most learned university faculties to the most popular vernacular health guides, was to flee, get out, leave the city and go to clean air in the countryside. Run away and run early and run fast. The Latin formulation was cedo, lunge, tard, flee quickly, flee far, return late. This advice, which sounds like an admission of defeat from a medical establishment that should be offering more, was actually among the most effective plague prevention strategies available, since it reduced both flea exposure and respiratory exposure to infected individuals. The physicians who recommended flight were not abandoning their patients. They were giving genuinely useful advice, for entirely the wrong reasons, and you find yourself wishing you had consulted a medieval physician before entering the city rather than after. The apothecary shop, which you find on a better street near the market, is one of the more organized and professional establishments you have encountered today. The apothecary, the medieval pharmacist, licensed to prepare and sell medicinal compounds according to physician prescriptions, is operating with a focused industriousness that suggests he has not had a slow day since the plague arrived. His shop is fragrant with the dried herbs and spices that line the shelves in labeled ceramic jars, and he is currently grinding something in a mortar with the rhythmic, meditative concentration of a man for whom this action has become almost prayer. He has theriac in 3 different formulations and prices. He has plague water, a preparation of herbs distilled in wine that was one of the fashionable remedies of the moment. He has the dried toad amulets that the market woman was also selling, suggesting a supply chain that operates efficiently even in the current crisis. You buy a few things you probably do not need and feel marginally better for having done something, which is, when you think about it, at least partially what medicine has always been for. The sound reaches you before the sight does, which gives you a few seconds to prepare yourself, though preparation turns out to be inadequate. It is a rhythmic sound, low and collective, with a quality of sustained human effort behind it. Not quite music, not quite chanting, but somewhere between the two, carrying the particular resonance of many voices doing the same thing at the same time with genuine conviction. You are walking back toward the inn from the apothecary, your small collection of probably useless remedies tucked under your arm, when the sound comes around the corner ahead of you and grows steadily louder. And then the procession itself comes around the corner and you stop walking and simply stand and watch, because there is nothing else to do. There are perhaps 40 of them, moving in a slow column down the center of the street. They are men, mostly, though not exclusively, ranging in age from what looks like late adolescence to well past middle age, and they are dressed, or rather partially undressed, in a way that immediately communicates the nature and intention of their activity. Their upper bodies are bare despite the chill of the afternoon, and their backs and shoulders carry the evidence of what they have been doing to themselves. A landscape of welts and cuts and dried blood that maps the recent history of their devotion in red lines across pale skin. Each of them carries a leather scourge, a whip with multiple knotted tails, and as they walk they use these instruments on themselves and on each other, in a slow, synchronized rhythm that matches the chanting, and they do it with the focused, deliberate quality of people performing a ritual rather than in the frenzied, uncontrolled way that the word flagellation sometimes implies. These are the flagellants, and they are one of the most dramatic and disturbing social phenomena of the Black Death era. A movement that arose spontaneously in parts of Germany and the Low Countries in the late 1340s and spread rapidly through plague-affected regions with the kind of velocity that only movements offering desperate people something, anything, to do in the face of catastrophe can achieve. The theology behind flagellation was not new. Self-mortification as a form of penance had a long history in Christian practice, and individual flagellants had existed within the monastic tradition for centuries. What was new was the scale, the organization, and the specific framing of the flagellant movement of the plague years, which held that the plague was God's punishment for human sin and that the appropriate response was public, collective, extreme penance, suffering inflicted on the body to mirror and perhaps satisfy the divine wrath that had been unleashed on humanity. You watch them pass and you feel several things simultaneously. There is something genuinely moving about the spectacle, in the way that any expression of collective human desperation in the face of overwhelming suffering is moving. These are people trying to do something, anything, in a situation that has taken away almost every tool of agency and control. They have lost family members. They have watched neighbors die. They have prayed in the normal way and the prayers have not seemed to stop anything. And so they have arrived at this. They will take the suffering into themselves, make themselves the instrument of penance, offer their own pain as a currency that might buy mercy for the rest. It is not rational in the epidemiological sense, but it is deeply, recognizably human. There is also something alarming about it, and not only because of the obvious immediate concerns about open wounds and blood in a city already struggling with disease. The flagellant movement had developed, by the time you are observing it, a theology and a social structure that had moved significantly outside the control of the institutional church, which was itself one of the most alarming aspects of the whole phenomenon from the perspective of church authorities. The flagellants were performing public religious ceremonies without priestly oversight or authorization. Some groups had developed their own liturgical forms, their own forms of absolution, with some leaders claiming that participation in the flagellant ritual could substitute for the sacrament of confession, which was a direct challenge to the sacerdotal authority of the priesthood. Some had begun preaching, and the content of their preaching had started to drift in directions that the church found distinctly uncomfortable. Pope Clement VI, sitting in Avignon, issued a papal bull condemning the flagellant movement in 1349, declaring its theology heretical and instructing church authorities to suppress it. This was a significant intervention, the Pope formally condemning a popular religious movement in the middle of a catastrophe, telling people that their chosen method of seeking divine mercy was wrong, and it tells you something about how seriously the institutional church took the threat that the movement represented. Not just the theological threat, though that was real, but the social and political threat of a mass movement operating outside ecclesiastical control, capable of mobilizing large numbers of desperate people around a narrative that had already, in some places, tipped from self-directed suffering into something considerably more dangerous. The more dangerous thing was scapegoating, and it was already happening in the streets of this city and across Europe with a systematic, murderous efficiency that represents one of the darkest chapters of the entire plague era. The logic of scapegoating in a crisis is depressingly consistent across human history. When something terrible happens without an adequate explanation, and when the available explanations, divine punishment, corrupt air, astrological misfortune, feel insufficiently concrete, there is a powerful psychological pressure to find a human agent, someone who can be blamed and punished and whose punishment might, in some satisfying way, address the catastrophe. In Plague-era Europe, this logic fell with devastating force on Jewish communities. The accusation that circulated through plague-affected Europe with horrifying speed was that Jews had caused the plague by poisoning the wells. The accusation was specific enough to feel concrete. Not a vague supernatural charge, but a particular claim about a particular action, and it spread through the communication networks of medieval Europe with the velocity that fear and hatred always travel. In city after city, Jewish communities were accused of well poisoning, tried in the travesty of proceedings that passed for legal process in conditions of mass hysteria, and massacred. In Strasbourg in 1349, 2,000 Jews were burned alive on a single day. In Mainz, the Jewish community fought back before being overwhelmed. In dozens of smaller communities across Germany, France, and the Low Countries, Jewish populations that had existed for generations were simply destroyed. Pope Clement VI, the same pope who would condemn the flagellants, issued 2 papal bulls condemning the persecution of Jews during the plague, pointing out with impeccable logic that Jews were dying of plague at the same rate as Christians, which rather undermined the theory that they had caused it. These bulls had some protective effect in some places and essentially none in others, because the social panic driving the pogroms was operating at a level of emotional intensity that rational argument was not well equipped to address. Historians still argue about the relative weight of spontaneous popular violence versus elite manipulation in driving the persecution of Jewish communities during the Black Death, whether what happened was primarily a bottom-up explosion of popular hysteria or whether it was organized and directed by elites who found the scapegoating of Jewish communities politically convenient. In the city you are currently navigating, you become aware of the Jewish quarter, if the city has one, and many medieval European cities did, as a place of particular tension and particular danger. The physical segregation of Jewish communities in medieval cities was itself a complex phenomenon, legally mandated in some places and voluntary in others, a form of communal self-protection as much as an imposed restriction, and the Jewish neighborhoods of medieval cities were often recognizable by their density and their defensiveness. Narrow streets, buildings that could be closed off and barricaded, the physical expression of communities that had learned to expect the possibility of violence and planned their architecture accordingly. You do not linger near the Jewish quarter. You have enough to worry about. The broader religious atmosphere of the plague city is one of intense, anxious spiritual activity, a city collectively trying every available lever of divine intervention simultaneously. The churches are open nearly continuously and the masses being said, or rather the masses being rattled through, because the priests who remain are covering more services than any individual was designed to perform, represent one continuous thread of liturgical petition that has been running, more or less without interruption, since the plague arrived. Votive candles burn in such quantities that the interiors of churches are genuinely warm from their collective heat, and the wax merchants of the city have experienced one of the few genuine economic booms of the plague period. The saints most invoked against plague were specific and widely agreed upon. Saint Sebastian, the Roman soldier martyr depicted tied to a post and pierced with arrows, was the primary plague saint. Arrows being the medieval symbol for sudden death from above, the divine punishment that plague resembled, and his image appeared in churches on amulets, on the painted wooden plague crosses that were erected at city gates and road junctions throughout the plague regions. Saint Roch, a French pilgrim who had reportedly survived plague while nursing plague victims and whose body was said to have been marked with a miraculous plague sore on his thigh, was the other great plague saint, his image typically showing him pointing to the sore on his leg with an expression of either stoic acceptance or mild surprise, depending on the artist. The procurement of indulgences, formal church documents reducing the time a soul would spend in purgatory after death, accelerated dramatically during the plague years, because people who were watching death arrive on an accelerated schedule became urgently interested in ensuring that the death they could not avoid would at least lead to the best possible afterlife outcome. Indulgences could be purchased, could be earned through pilgrimage, could be granted by the Pope for specific acts of piety or contributions to church projects, and the demand for them during the plague years was extraordinary. Pope Clement VI responded to this demand by granting a series of extremely broad indulgences during the plague years, including one that extended remission of sins to all who died of plague after making confession. A pastoral provision that acknowledged the reality that many plague victims would not have the opportunity for a proper deathbed ritual, and that tried to address the spiritual anxiety this created. The flagellant procession has passed now, turned down a side street and taken its rhythmic, unsettling sound with it, and the street is quieter in its wake. People who had stepped into doorways and shops to let the procession pass are filtering back out, resuming their careful navigation of the afternoon. A few of them watched the direction the flagellants went with expressions that range from reverence to unease to a kind of exhausted familiarity. This is not the first procession this week, and it will not be the last. There is a priest standing on the steps of a small chapel across the street, watching the aftermath of the procession with an expression that you can read, even from this distance, as deeply conflicted. He is a young man, this priest, younger than you would expect for someone bearing the evident responsibility of a parish in crisis, with the kind of face that has aged several years in several months, carrying the particular premature gravity of someone who has administered last rites more times in recent weeks than the actuarial tables of normal life would have suggested he would in a decade. He is watching the direction the flagellants went with the expression of a man who understands the impulse entirely, who feels in himself the same desperate desire to do something physical and tangible in the face of spiritual catastrophe, and who is simultaneously bound by the institutional constraints of a church that has told him the flagellants are wrong. You catch his eye by accident as you look at him, and for a moment he holds your gaze, a brief, unexpected connection across the careful distances that everyone in this city is maintaining. He gives you a small nod. You return it. He goes back inside the chapel. The afternoon has moved toward early evening, and the light is going the particular shade of amber that turns even a plague city beautiful for a few minutes, gilding the plaster walls and the cobblestones and the smoke rising from the burning aromatic herbs, turning the narrow strip of sky above the street into something that looks briefly like hope. The death bells are ringing their slow count. Somewhere deeper in the city, there is the sound of the flagellants starting up again. That low, rhythmic chanting, fading and then swelling as the wind shifts. You walk back toward the inn, past the houses with their red crosses and their shuttered windows, past the church with its extraordinary quantity of candles, past the man who is still sitting on his doorstep with his blank, beyond grief expression, past a group of children. There are still children, playing some kind of chasing game in an alley with the intense, focused energy of children for whom the adult world's catastrophe is real but not yet fully legible, processed into the background of a life that still contains play and running and the specific joy of being 8 years old and faster than your friend. You watch the children for a moment. This is, you find, the thing that undoes you slightly. Not the smell, not the sound of coughing through the wall, not the plague cart or the flagellants or the red crosses on the doors. The children playing. The absolute, unconquerable persistence of ordinary life in the midst of extraordinary death. You keep walking. The death cart comes through your street just before dawn. You know this because you are not sleeping. You have been lying on the flea-infested mattress in your room at the inn, conducting a running internal debate about whether the itching sensations you are experiencing are psychosomatic or entomological, listening to the coughing through the wall that has not stopped since you went upstairs, and watching the candle burn down with the patient attention of someone who has decided that sleep is a theoretical concept that applies to other people in other cities. The cart's squeaky wheel, possibly the same cart you heard in the market square yesterday, possibly a different one, the plague city apparently running a fleet of them, announces itself from several streets away and grows steadily louder until it is directly below your shuttered window. And then there are voices, low and matter-of-fact, and the sounds of activity that you identify and then firmly decline to examine further. And then the cart moves on, its squeaky wheel fading back into the pre-dawn quiet. You lie there in the dark and think about what it means to be the person driving that cart. The organization of death in a medieval plague city is one of the most revealing things about how human societies function under extreme pressure, revealing both of the remarkable capacity for institutional adaptation that communities can demonstrate and of the profound human cost that adaptation extracts from the individuals who do the most dangerous and necessary work. In a normal medieval city at a normal time, the dead were managed through a set of well-established, deeply ritualized processes that involved the family, the parish, the church, and the guild structures of the community in carefully defined roles. Person died. The family washed the body and laid it out. The parish priest was called to perform the last rites if they had not already been administered. The body was watched through the night. The wake, a word that reflects the original literal meaning of staying awake beside the dead. The funeral took place within a day or two, involving a procession to the church, a mass, and burial in the churchyard. The whole process was embedded in community ritual and religious meaning, surrounded by the presence of family and neighbors, marked by the physical proximity of the living to the dead that expressed the bonds of love and the continuity of community across the threshold of death. The plague had dismantled this process so thoroughly that its absence was itself a form of grief layered on top of the grief of losing people. There was no time for wakes. There was no time for the careful washing and preparation of bodies. There were not enough priests to perform individual masses for individual dead, and there were not enough churchyards, those neatly bounded, consecrated plots of land attached to parish churches, with their capacity carefully calculated for normal death rates, to receive the bodies that were arriving at them. The plague pits you saw on the road coming in were not a failure of civilization but an adaptation to it, a rational response to an impossible arithmetic: too many dead, too little space, too few living workers to manage the transition between the two states with the dignity that ordinary death demanded. The gravediggers of the plague city occupied a social position of extraordinary ambiguity. They were essential. Without them, the city would have been uninhabitable within weeks, the decomposing dead generating the very miasmatic conditions that everyone feared, and they were paid accordingly, their wages reflecting the combination of indispensability and mortal risk that their work entailed. They were also feared and avoided with an intensity that went beyond the rational concern about disease transmission and into something more atavistic, the deep human discomfort with those who handle the dead professionally, the sense that constant proximity to death might transfer some of its quality to the living. Gravediggers in plague cities were sometimes required to live separately from the general population, to identify themselves with particular clothing or markings, to shop at separate stalls in the market. They were simultaneously indispensable and untouchable, which is a social position that tends not to be comfortable regardless of the wages. The people who drove the death carts, the person whose pre-dawn passage beneath your window has just definitively ended any remaining possibility of sleep, were often recruited from the margins of society, the very poor, who had fewer options and for whom the wages represented a meaningful improvement in their survival chances despite the risks. Convicted criminals offered commutation of sentences in exchange for cart service, and, with a grim irony that contemporaries did not fail to notice, plague survivors, who were believed, correctly as it happens, to have some degree of immunity after recovery, and who were therefore considered safer for this work than those who had not yet been exposed. The plague survivor driving the death cart is one of the quietly devastating images of the era. A person whose survival has become the credential that qualifies them for the most dangerous job in a city of dangerous jobs. You get up before full light, because there is no point in lying on the mattress any longer, and you make your way downstairs to find the innkeeper already awake and doing something with the fire that involves a great deal of poker work and focused attention. She gives you a look that communicates, without words, that she too has been awake for some time and that the pre-dawn cart passage is not a novelty. She pours you something warm from a pot by the fire, a tisane of some kind, herbs steeped in hot water, smelling of rosemary and something floral, and you accept it with a gratitude that is somewhat disproportionate to the quality of the beverage but entirely proportionate to the quality of the gesture. You ask her carefully about the churchyard. You have been thinking about the churchyards since you arrived, about their capacity, about the logistics of burial in a city where the death rate has exceeded any previous experience, about what happens to the physical and spiritual geography of a place when its dead begin to outnumber its living by a widening margin. She tells you, with the flat informational tone of someone who has processed this reality and filed it in the folder marked just how things are now, that the churchyard attached to the parish church 3 streets over has been full for 6 weeks, that 2 of the other parish churchyards in this neighborhood have been extended once already and will need extending again soon, and that the main overflow burial ground, not the pit you saw on the road in, which is a different one, is at the edge of the city near the north wall. The question of what to do with the dead in a plague city had practical, spiritual, and deeply social dimensions that were all in tension with each other simultaneously. The practical dimension was the simplest. Bodies in warm weather decompose quickly, and the products of decomposition are genuinely hazardous. So dead bodies needed to be interred promptly and at sufficient depth and distance from water sources to prevent contamination. Medieval people did not know the specific mechanism of this hazard, but they understood the general principle, that proximity to decomposing bodies was bad for the living, and the urgency of burial was partly driven by this practical understanding. The spiritual dimension was considerably more complicated. Christian theology in the medieval period held that the body, as the vessel that would be resurrected at the Last Judgment, deserved dignified treatment after death, proper washing, proper shrouding, burial in consecrated ground with appropriate rites. The burial in consecrated ground was not merely a preference but a theological necessity. To be buried outside the churchyard in unconsecrated soil was to be excluded from the community of the saved in a way that carried real eschatological weight. The mass graves that the plague necessitated, the hurried rites performed over dozens of bodies simultaneously, the burials in ground that had been hastily consecrated in a crisis response rather than properly established. All of these compromises generated genuine spiritual anxiety, not just for the bereaved families but for the priests and church authorities who were making the compromises. Pope Clement VI responded to this anxiety with one of the more practically compassionate acts of his plague-era papacy. He consecrated the Rhone River itself in the vicinity of Avignon, so that bodies being thrown into it, a practice that had apparently become common enough to require papal response, would be receiving something approaching Christian burial. The image of a pope standing at a riverbank and consecrating a river so that the plague dead floating in it might have the benefit of holy water is one of those historical details that sits at the intersection of the heartbreaking and the surreal, a moment that perfectly captures the scale of the catastrophe and the genuine pastoral care of an institution doing its best to provide spiritual comfort in conditions that had exceeded all its existing frameworks. The gravediggers you see working at the northern burial ground, when you make your way there in the thin morning light, drawn by a combination of historical curiosity and the particular insomniac restlessness of a person who has given up on sleep and might as well see everything there is to see, are working in pairs, methodically and without apparent distress, the way people work when the distress has been metabolized into the background of their daily experience. The ground here is freshly turned in long strips, the soil dark and damp in the morning air. There are wooden markers at intervals, crude crosses, some with names scratched into them, some without any identification at all, just a cross in the ground marking a human life whose name did not make it to the marker. There are a lot of crosses without names. A monk is moving along the row of markers, pausing at each one, murmuring something too quiet to hear from where you are standing. He is young. They are often young now, the priests and monks performing burial rites, because the older, more experienced ones died first, having been most exposed to the sick and dying, and he moves with a combination of exhaustion and purpose that is one of the defining physical expressions of the plague era. He is doing what can be done. He is doing it without stopping. He will continue doing it until he cannot. The social consequences of mass death in the plague city radiated outward from the burial grounds into every aspect of community life, reshaping the social fabric in ways that were immediately visible and in other ways that would take generations to become apparent. The most immediately visible consequence was the orphan crisis. Medieval family structures were already fragile by modern standards. High child mortality was normal, and children growing up without one parent or both was common enough that orphan care was an established function of church and guild institutions. But the plague's habit of killing entire households simultaneously, taking parents and children and grandparents in the same terrible week, created an orphan population that exceeded the existing institutional capacity to absorb it. Children who survived the death of their household found themselves in a social limbo, too young to manage the property and business that might have been their inheritance, too numerous for the monasteries and hospitals that normally cared for orphans, in a city where many of the adults who would normally have taken in orphan neighbors' children were either dead themselves or struggling to survive. Some of these children ended up in the households of relatives who had survived, absorbed into reconstituted family units. Some ended up in institutional care of variable quality. Some ended up on the streets, and the plague city's population of homeless children, visible in doorways, visible in the market, visible at the edges of the burial grounds, watching the monks with the particular watchfulness of children trying to understand something very large, was one of the more heartbreaking visible consequences of the epidemic. The inheritance law complications created by mass death were staggering, and the legal systems of medieval Europe were genuinely overwhelmed by them. When a person died, their property passed according to the rules of inheritance, to spouse, to children, to more distant relatives in sequence. When an entire family died simultaneously or within days of each other, establishing the order of death and therefore the chain of inheritance became a legal nightmare. Notaries and lawyers who had been busy before the plague were now among the most in-demand professionals in the city, summoned to deathbeds to take down wills at speed, called in afterward to untangle inheritance disputes that arose when the normal family structures that inheritance law assumed had been dissolved by epidemic. Wills written during the plague years are among the most poignant primary sources of the era. Brief, urgent documents dictated by people who knew they were dying and were trying to impose some order on what would come after. They reveal people giving away not just property but the small, specific items of daily life. A particular cloak to a friend who had admired it, a silver cup to the church, a book to a literate neighbor, a tool to the apprentice who would need it to continue the trade. They reveal people trying to make provision for children they knew might not survive them, naming guardians and specifying care arrangements with the particular anxiety of parents dying too young. They reveal, in their specificity and their urgency, the texture of individual lives being rapidly concluded, the human particular asserting itself against the historical general right up to the final moment. You stand at the edge of the burial ground as the morning fully arrives, watching the gravediggers work and the monk pray and the thin winter light spread across the turned earth, and you feel, alongside everything else you are feeling, which is quite a lot, a profound, aching respect for the people doing this work. Not the dramatic, visible work of the physician or the priest or even the flagellants in their terrible procession, but the quiet, essential, entirely unglamorous work of the men with the shovels, putting the dead in the ground with as much dignity as circumstances allow, day after day, in a city that is producing more dead than any city was designed to accommodate. They do not look up as you turn and walk back toward the city. They have work to do. The idea of leaving comes to you the way most good ideas come to you in a crisis, not as a sudden revelation but as a slow accumulation of evidence that eventually achieves a critical mass and tips over into decision. You have been in the city for 2 days now, which is long enough to have developed a comprehensive understanding of why staying is inadvisable, and not nearly long enough to have developed the fatalistic attachment to the place that seems to afflict its longer-term residents. The coughing through the wall has not stopped. The mattress continues its campaign against your peace of mind and possibly your health. The man on the doorstep is still there every time you pass, still staring at the middle distance with his expression of post-grief blankness. The death cart has come through your street twice more. You have spent money you cannot really afford on remedies that you do not really believe in, eaten food of uncertain provenance, drunk water of uncertain safety, and accumulated a low-level ambient anxiety that has settled into your chest like a houseguest who has unpacked their bags and shows no sign of leaving. You are going to leave. The question is how. This question turns out to be considerably more complicated than it sounds, because the plague city of 1348 is not merely a place you can walk out of the way you walked in. The same forces that made entering the city a negotiation, the guards at the gate, the assessment of your health, the implicit calculation about whether your presence was worth the risk, apply with considerably greater force to leaving it, and they apply in both directions. The city you are in does not particularly want to let you out, and the world outside the city does not particularly want to let you in, and the space between those two positions is where your escape plan currently lies. The formal quarantine measures of the plague era were inconsistent, improvised, and unevenly enforced, but they were real, and they reflected a genuine, if imperfect, understanding of the plague's contagious nature. Different cities and regions had developed different approaches, ranging from the Venetian model of maritime quarantine, ships held offshore for 40 days before passengers could disembark, to the more informal cordon sanitaire systems that some territories attempted to establish around plague-affected areas, stationing guards on the roads leading out of infected cities with instructions to turn back travelers who appeared to be coming from plague zones. The problem with these systems, from the perspective of someone trying to implement them, was the same problem that has attended every attempt at disease containment throughout history. The people most motivated to cross the cordon are precisely the people most likely to be fleeing an infection zone. A traveler stopped on the road outside a plague city and asked where they have come from faces an obvious incentive to lie, and medieval checkpoint systems had no reliable way to verify the truth of what they were told. You could say you were from a village 10 miles in the other direction that had no plague. You could say you had been traveling for 3 weeks and had not been in an infected city. You could present yourself with the confident demeanor of someone who has nothing to hide. which is harder than it sounds when you have been sleeping on a flea-infested mattress in a plague inn for 2 days, and your eyes have the slightly haunted quality of someone who has been awake since a death cart passed beneath their window. You go back to the main gate through which you entered, because it is the gate, and because the guard who let you in, the young one with the patchy beard, is someone whose face you can recognize and who has, in the logic of your current situation, achieved the status of a known quantity, which is more than can be said for most things in this city. The gate is guarded now by 2 different men, neither of whom is the young guard from your arrival, and they are considerably less casual about their inspection than he was. The older of the 2, a large man with the permanent squint of someone who has spent years standing outdoors in all weathers, stops you at a distance of several meters and asks the questions with the efficiency of someone who has asked them many times today. Where are you going? How long have you been in the city? Have you had contact with anyone who was sick? Do you have any swellings? He does not wait for your answers with the open-minded receptivity of a person genuinely evaluating your responses. He listens to your answers with the specific quality of attention of someone checking them against a pre-existing determination, and you get the strong sense that his pre-existing determination is not favorably disposed toward letting people out. There is a document requirement, you discover, that you were not aware of when you entered. Some cities in plague-affected Europe had begun issuing what were essentially early health certificates, written attestations that the bearer had been examined and found free of plague symptoms, issued by a physician or city official and required for travel between certain destinations. The system was chaotic and inconsistently applied, and the documents were easily forged, but it existed, and the guard at this gate is asking for yours with the air of a man who knows you probably do not have one and is interested to see what you do about that. You do not have one. Of course you do not have one. You did not know you needed one when you came in, and the physician you saw yesterday, while thorough in his humoral assessment and generous with his theriac prescription, did not mention the possibility of issuing a health certificate, possibly because the fee for doing so had not yet come up in conversation, or possibly because the system in this particular city is even more improvised than you had hoped. The negotiation that follows is one of the more delicate social performances you will attempt during your time in the plague city, involving the careful management of several competing pressures simultaneously. You need to appear healthy enough that the guard is not simply going to refuse you on sight. You need to appear sufficiently credible that your account of your recent whereabouts is believed, or at least not disbelieved with enough conviction to justify detaining you. You need to navigate the implicit financial dimension of the conversation, the possibility that the document requirement is being enforced with a flexibility that is inversely proportional to the size of a certain kind of informal payment, without either insulting the guard by assuming this too openly or missing the opportunity if it exists. And you need to do all of this while maintaining the calm, unruffled demeanor that the physician told you was essential for humoral balance, which is not easy when you are standing at a city gate trying to talk your way past a guard in a plague city. The negotiation concludes in a way that costs you more money than you would like and produces an outcome that is technically satisfactory. You are allowed to proceed toward the gate, but comes with a condition that the guard delivers with the flat certainty of someone reading from an invisible rulebook. You will need to go to the city recorder's office and obtain a travel document before you can actually pass through. The city recorder's office is, he tells you with no apparent appreciation of the irony, on the other side of the city from where you are currently standing. You consider this for a moment, then turn around and walk back into the city. The city recorder's office, when you find it after 40 minutes of navigation through streets you are becoming grimly familiar with, is a small, dark room attached to the side of the town hall, staffed by a single clerk of about 35, who gives the impression of having aged significantly in recent weeks, and who is surrounded by an extraordinary quantity of paper. Documents stacked on every surface, rolls of parchment in wooden holders on the shelves, loose sheets weighed down by ink pots, and small clay figurines of saints who are presumably being asked to intercede on behalf of the filing system. The clerk looks up when you enter with the expression of a man who has been asked to process more requests than any individual should be asked to process, and who has developed a relationship with his workload that is somewhere between resentment and grim professional pride. The process of obtaining a travel document involves providing your name, your place of origin, your destination, and a declaration that you have been in the city for fewer than a certain number of days and have not been in contact with plague cases, and then waiting while the clerk writes this information on a piece of parchment in the careful, formal hand of someone for whom document production is a serious craft. He asks you whether you have been examined by a physician. You tell him yes, which is true. He asks for the physician's name. You provide it. He writes it down. He asks for your seal, and you explain that you do not have a personal seal because you are a traveler, and he produces a small wooden stamp from a drawer and uses it to apply an official mark to the document, which he then dusts with fine sand to dry the ink, shakes off, rolls into a small cylinder, and ties with a strip of leather. He names his fee. You pay it. You are developing a deep appreciation for the economic ecosystem of the Plague City, which has found a way to monetize absolutely every interaction between a traveler and the administrative apparatus of a city that very much would prefer you to stay and is charging you progressively for the privilege of leaving. The document in hand, you make your way back across the city. Past the man on the doorstep, past the church with its candles, past the market with its reduced stalls and its smells, and back to the main gate, which is now being managed by yet another pair of guards, neither of whom is the man you negotiated with earlier. This new guard examines your document with the careful attention of someone who is not entirely sure what a legitimate document looks like versus a forged one, but is determined to look as though he is. He holds it up to the light. He turns it over. He looks at the official stamp with a frown that might be suspicion or might be presbyopia. He asks you the same questions his predecessor asked. He looks at your neck and hands. He lets you through. The moment you step outside the gate, you feel something shift in your chest. A loosening of the tightness that has been there since you walked in, a small but genuine decrease in the ambient fear that has been running as background process in your nervous system for the past 2 days. The air outside the walls is not cleaner, exactly. You are still close enough to the city that its smell follows you, but it feels cleaner, which is almost the same thing. The road stretches ahead of you, muddy and rutted and entirely ordinary, and you feel for the road the way you might feel for a rescue rope. Not beautiful but real and going in the right direction. This feeling lasts for approximately 40 minutes. The checkpoint on the road is set up at a narrowing where the road passes between a stand of trees on one side and a low stone wall on the other, chosen with obvious tactical intelligence by whoever established it. There are 3 men here, not city guards but men in the livery of whatever local lord or authority controls this stretch of road, armed with halberds and the specific watchfulness of people who have been told to stop everyone and believe everyone is a threat. They step into the road when they see you coming with a coordinated efficiency that suggests they have been doing this for long enough to have developed a routine. The questions are the same questions, but the attitude behind them is different. The city guards were primarily managing flow, deciding who could enter and exit based on criteria that, however imperfect, were at least nominally about public health. These men are operating under a different mandate, which is to protect the territories and communities behind them from the thing that is inside the city you just came from, and their criteria for making decisions are correspondingly more paranoid and less negotiable. They are not interested in your document from the city recorder's office, which they examine with deep suspicion and return to you with the manner of people who have decided it is probably forged. They are interested in where you are going, who you know there, and why they should believe anything you say. You explain. You show your document. You submit to examination of your neck and hands and the inside of your lower arms. You answer every question carefully and completely. You project calm, which takes genuine effort and which you achieve by focusing very specifically on the texture of the road surface beneath your feet and counting the stones in the wall to your left. A grounding technique that would not be invented for another 600 years but which works perfectly well in 1348. They make you wait. One of them goes back along the road, apparently to consult with someone not visible to you. You stand in the thin afternoon light and wait and try not to think about what happens if the answer comes back no. No would mean being turned back toward the city. Being turned back toward the city would mean another night on the flea mattress with the coughing through the wall and the pre-dawn death cart. You have paid so much money in the past 2 days for things you did not want that the prospect of paying more feels almost abstractly funny, the kind of thing that will be a story later if there is a later. The guard comes back. He confers briefly with his colleagues in low voices. He looks at you with the assessing squint of a man making a final calculation. He steps aside. You walk past the checkpoint without looking back because looking back feels like a mistake, the kind of thing that turns you into a pillar of salt in a story, and you are going to concentrate very specifically on the road ahead and the next village and the fact that you are, for now, moving in the right direction. The road curves through the stand of trees and the checkpoint disappears behind you and the city walls are still visible above the treeline but getting smaller. And the afternoon is cold and the road is muddy and your feet hurt in the way that medieval feet always hurt. And you are, for the moment, behind you in the city, the death bells are ringing. You can hear them even out here, carried on the wind with a clarity that the distance seems to sharpen rather than diminish, as if the sound has been refined by traveling through all that cold air into something more essential and more specific. One bell and then a pause and then another, counting. You walk faster. The road takes you east as the afternoon light fails, and the city behind you becomes a silhouette, towers and roofline and the thin threads of smoke from 100 hearths, dark against a sky that is going from pale gold to deep amber to the particular blue-gray of a winter evening settling in over northern Europe. You walk until the silhouette is small enough that the death bells are more felt than heard, a low vibration in the air rather than a specific sound, and then you walk a little further still until even that fades, and there is nothing around you but the road and the fields on either side and the first stars appearing in the darkening sky above. You stop walking. You stand in the middle of the empty road and breathe. The air out here is different. Not clean in the way that modern air is clean, because there is no such thing as modern air here. And the medieval countryside has its own smells of damp earth and animal and wood smoke from distant farmhouses. But it is unutterably different from the air inside the walls. There is space in it. There is the smell of cold mud and bare winter trees, and the particular freshness of a sky that has not been filtered through centuries of accumulated urban life. You breathe it in slowly and deliberately, the way the physician told you to breathe when maintaining humoral balance, and this time the instruction makes a different kind of sense. Not the theoretical sense of humoral medicine, but the simple, bodily sense of a person who has been breathing badly for 2 days and is now breathing well. What you are carrying out of the city, though, is not nothing. It travels with you the way experience always travels, embedded in the body, in the particular quality of alertness that 2 days in a plague city has installed in your nervous system, in the itch of flea bites on your ankles that you are trying very hard not to interpret as anything other than flea bites. You are carrying the smell or the memory of the smell, which is almost the same thing and which your brain will continue producing at unexpected moments for a long time to come. You are carrying the sound of coughing through a thin wall. You are carrying the image of the death cart in the market square, and the man on the doorstep, and the children playing their chasing game in the alley with the focused, unconquerable energy of children who have not yet been told that they should stop. You are carrying something else too, something harder to name, a recalibration of your understanding of what ordinary life is and what it is worth. The medieval plague city has a way of doing this to a person. It strips away the assumption of normalcy that underlies daily life in any era. The assumption that tomorrow will exist, that the people you love will still be here next week, that the systems and structures that organize your world will continue to function in their familiar ways, and replaces it with a raw, unmediated awareness of contingency. Everything you have contingently. The clean air you are breathing right now, the road under your feet, the fact that your lymph nodes are not swollen. All of it contingent, all of it temporary, all of it precious in a way that is very difficult to feel clearly until you have spent some time in a place where its absence is visible on every street corner. The medieval world understood this in ways that modern life tends to obscure. The concept of memento mori, remember that you will die, was not merely a philosophical flourish in the medieval period but a practical, daily orientation toward existence, expressed in art and architecture and the rhythms of liturgical life. The skull carved above the church door. The dance of death painted on the charnel house wall, showing kings and peasants and merchants and priests all joining hands with grinning skeletons in the same final dance. The Dies Irae, the great medieval hymn of judgment and mortality, sung at funerals with a dramatic intensity that did not shy away from the terror of the final reckoning. These were not expressions of morbidity in the modern pathological sense, but of a culture that had integrated the fact of death into the fabric of daily life, that had decided to look at it directly rather than away, and that had found in that direct looking a kind of fierce, clear-eyed appreciation for the life happening right now, in the present moment, before the dance begins. The people you watched survive in the plague city, the innkeeper with her fire and her tisane, the young gravedigger working in the thin morning light, the monk moving along the row of markers, the priest giving his small nod from the chapel steps, the children in the alley, were all, in their different ways, practicing a form of this. Not denial. Not the forced cheerfulness of people pretending everything was fine when everything manifestly was not. Something harder and more honest than that. The decision to keep doing the next thing, to keep performing the acts of daily life with as much care and as much humanity as the circumstances allowed, because the alternative was to stop, and stopping was a form of dying before you were dead. The road ahead of you curves into a shallow valley where you can see, perhaps a mile distant, the lights of a village beginning to appear, small, warm, yellow points of light in the darkening landscape, the fires and candles of an evening settlement going about its end-of-day business. The village may have plague. Most places do or will. The proportion of the European landscape that was untouched by the Black Death was very small, and the fiction of the safe rural retreat, the fantasy of fleeing to clean country air and finding a world where the catastrophe had not arrived, was exactly that, a fiction. The physician's advice of ceto, lunge, tard was sound in principle and frequently impossible in practice, because the long and the far were themselves plague-touched, and the late return was to a world that had been changed in ways that no amount of absence could have prepared you for. What the survivors of the Black Death returned to, those who survived the epidemic itself and then lived long enough to see its aftermath, was a world that was in many ways unrecognizable from the one they had left. The population of Europe would not recover to pre-plague levels for over a century, in some regions longer. The social and economic structures built on the assumption of a large, cheap, relatively immobile peasant labor force had been shaken to their foundations. The Church, which had failed so visibly to prevent or explain the catastrophe, despite being the institution whose entire purpose was to mediate between human suffering and divine meaning, had suffered a crisis of authority and credibility from which it would never fully recover, and which planted some of the seeds of the reforming movements that would shake European Christianity 2 centuries later. The medical establishment, too, was changed. The complete failure of learned university medicine to do anything useful about the plague, to prevent it, to treat it, to even explain it in terms that carried predictive power, was not lost on the populations who had watched the physicians with their theriac and their bloodletting and their humoral theory fail just as thoroughly as the lay healers and the empiricists and the wise women. The authority of text-based, theoretically orthodox medicine had been dented in ways that would gradually, over the following centuries, open space for the empirical and experimental approaches that would eventually produce something that actually worked. Historians still argue about the extent to which the Black Death should be understood as a rupture. A genuine break in historical continuity that created the conditions for the Renaissance, the Reformation, the emergence of capitalism, and the eventual scientific revolution, or whether this narrative imposes too neat a causality on a set of transformations that had multiple, complex, overlapping causes of which the plague was only one. The rupture narrative is satisfying, the way that stories with clear causes and clear effects are always satisfying, but history rarely works with that kind of clarity. And the people living through the plague in 1348 were not aware that they were clearing the ground for a flowering of European civilization. They were trying to find food and shelter and get their documents stamped and pay too much for theriac and convince gate guards to let them through. They were doing, in other words, what you have been doing for the past 2 days. And most of them, the remarkable, stubborn, adaptive majority, survived it, not unscathed, not unchanged, but alive, and carrying forward into the changed world everything they had learned from the world that the plague had unmade. The village lights are closer now. You have been walking without noticing that you were walking, carried forward by the momentum of the road and the cooling evening air and the particular forward-leaning quality of a person who is leaving something behind and moving towards something warmer. Your feet still hurt. Your ankles still itch. You are hungry again, which is annoying, but also, in the way that hunger always is, a reminder that you are alive and that being alive involves wants, and that wants, however inconvenient, are better than their absence. You think about the innkeeper's pottage. You think about sitting by a fire. You think about a room where the wall is thick enough that you cannot hear what is happening in the next one. You think about sleep, real sleep, the kind that comes when the body's accumulated exhaustion finally overcomes the mind's accumulated anxiety, and the thought of it is so appealing that you almost stop walking just to appreciate the anticipation of it. You do not stop. You keep walking, as people have always kept walking, toward the lights in the valley and the warmth they promise and the ordinary human evening that waits on the other side of this long, strange, unforgettable day. And now, slowly, gently, we let the medieval city recede. Let the cobblestones soften under your feet. Let the smell of the city dissolve into the clean, dark air of wherever you are right now. Your room, your bed, the particular quiet of your own familiar space. Let the death bells fade until they are just silence. Let the red crosses on the doors and the plague carts and the flagellant procession all move to a comfortable distance. The way things in dreams move when you are beginning to surface from them. Present but no longer pressing, interesting but no longer frightening. You are here. You are warm. The air around you is clear and the people you love are where you left them, which is not a small thing. It is, if you let yourself feel it clearly for a moment, an extraordinary thing. The kind of thing that the people in the plague city would have recognized immediately as a gift. The kind of thing that the medieval artist painting the dance of death on the charnel house wall was trying to say. In the most dramatic way available to him, this, right now, this ordinary evening, this quiet and warmth and safety, is the thing. This is the whole thing. The road the medieval traveler walked is very long and you have walked a piece of it tonight, and now you can rest. Let your breathing slow. Let your body settle into the surface beneath you. Bed, couch, floor, wherever you have made your resting place tonight. Let the weight of the day distribute itself and dissolve. Let your thoughts move if they want to move and slow if they want to slow, drifting like the smoke from a medieval hearth, rising and dispersing and becoming just air. The city is quiet now. The bells have stopped. Somewhere in a village a mile down a muddy road, a fire is burning and a pot is on the heat and the evening is ordinary and safe. Sleep well. You made it.